Gaza Strip. Now, according to the health ministry in Gaza, an estimated 18,787 Palestinians, predominantly women and children, have been killed. And at least about 50,000 Palestinians have been seriously wounded or maimed in this campaign of relentless bombardment by the Israelis. The Prime Minister Netanyahu has vowed to press ahead with the Israeli offensive until what he describes is the end, and is rejecting all international pressure for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. Now, Israel has vowed that it will continue till Hamas is eliminated, while much of the Gaza Strip has been reduced to nothing more than rubble. The Hamas fighters continue to maintain a pretty firm foothold in the besieged Gaza Strip, and the big question, of course, is, has Israel managed to weaken Hamas, and how far has it succeeded in rooting out Hamas? We're not talking militarily, but also in its standing amongst the Palestinian people. A wartime opinion poll amongst the Palestinian people shows a sharp rise in support for the resistance that Hamas fighters have been putting up, which appears to have ticked up even in the devastated Gaza Strip. The opinion poll also shows an overwhelming rejection of the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, with nearly 90% of the Palestinian people saying that he must actually resign forthwith. The West Bank-based Palestinian Authority governed Gaza until a takeover by Hamas in 2007. Washington has called for the West Bank-based Palestinian Authority, currently led by Abbas, to eventually assume control of Gaza and to run both territories as a precursor to statehood. But Hamas has warned that any plans for Gaza that do not involve the group are an illusion and a mirage.
Any bet-on arrangements in Gaza or in the Palestinian cause in general without Hamas and the resistance factions is an illusion and a mirage.
I think it's very important that we should all realize that Hamas is an integral part of the Palestinian political mosaic. And therefore, for Israel to claim that they are going to eliminate Hamas, I think this is something that is totally, first of all, is not going to happen, and totally is not acceptable to us.
Now remember, Israel has drawn widespread international condemnation and also rare criticism from its staunchest ally, the United States, over the killings of tens of thousands of Palestinians in a span of just 2 months. The American President Joe Biden has said that Israel is actually losing support with its campaign of indiscriminate bombing of the Gaza Strip, and that Benjamin Netanyahu should actually change his tactics, exposing a clear rift in the relations between Joe Biden and the Israeli Prime Minister.
We have every expectation that Israel will do exactly what they say they're doing, which is to continue to go after the terrorist leaders and to do so in a way that minimizes civilian harm, as I said in my opening statement, as the President has said. That's their intent, and it's important that the results match that intent.
But also, Biden told a predominantly Jewish audience in the White House that Israel is in a pretty tight spot and that he has made his differences with Netanyahu pretty clear.
Assistance to innocent Palestinian civilians who emphasize to our friends, to our Israeli friends, we need to protect civilian life.
But there's also a word of advice from the retired U.S. Army General David Petraeus, citing experience of American troops fighting with al-Qaeda in Iraq. The former director of the CIA has cautioned that the very idea of Hamas must in fact also be combated, and this can only be done by making the life of the Palestinian people better than it was under Hamas's rule. The Biden administration is reportedly delaying the sale of more than 20,000 American-made assault rifles to Israel, over concerns that these assault rifles could actually end up in the hands of these illegal Israeli settlers who resorted to a lot of violence and killings of the Palestinians in the West Bank. The Biden administration is apparently worried that a lot of these weapons could, of course, end up stoking more violence in the West Bank, a place where Hamas does not even exist. The administration last week began imposing visa bans on these illegal, violent Israeli settlers who've been involved in violent activities in the West Bank. All right, now to give us more perspective in terms of what, of course, is happening in this war, we're being joined by retired Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, who is a military expert and also the host of the Daniel Davis Deep Dive on YouTube. He's joining us live from Sterling in Virginia. Now, Colonel Davis, these are some pretty strong words that we've heard from the American president. The differences between the American leadership, that is Joe Biden, and Netanyahu appear to be pretty clear. And also Jake Sullivan is, of course, traveling to Israel. What message do you think the Americans are giving to the Israelis in the aftermath of the horrific death toll of the Palestinians that we witnessed?
Well, I think that poll numbers that you cited just a moment ago is pretty sobering information and really confirms what many people here in the United States and apparently in the administration has been saying. You can't kill your way to peace in this situation. You can't just say we're going to kill all the Hamas fighters and then we're going to have peace, because you see there's been such a massive destruction of the ability of the Palestinians to even live after this is over, on top of the scores of thousands that have been killed and tens of thousands more that have been wounded. All that does is breed more contempt for Israel and more hatred. And when you see both in the Gaza Strip and in the West Bank, actually a higher percentage of people in the West Bank in that same poll said that they believed that Hamas was right on October 7th because of all the carnage that they have seen. So Israel is going backwards in terms of creating a possibility of peace for its people by this indiscriminate killing of people in pursuit of Hamas. But I'll tell you one other thing, even tactically speaking, there's almost no way that Israel can accomplish its goals of destroying Hamas and killing everybody, because how do they even know who Hamas is? I mean, unless you have a roster, they don't wear uniforms. And how do you distinguish a Hamas terrorist from just an angry Palestinian man who's upset that his family got killed or something? And you see that you're just going to create more and more. I've seen it with my own eyes in combat. And if they don't change something, they're not going to attain their political outcome, and they're going to create more strife for the future.
You know, it's interesting that you mentioned this, because this is an interesting sentiment that was also echoed by General David Petraeus. He said that it is important to win the battle of hearts and minds, and if Israel is serious about actually rooting out Hamas, then Israel's job is to make the lives of the Palestinians better than what they had when Hamas was, of course, ruling them in the Gaza Strip. Do you think the Americans would be pushing the Israelis to, in fact, change their tactics? Because to root out Hamas, you need to convince the Palestinian people about it. And before this conflict began, before the 7th of October, Hamas's popularity within the Gazan people, the Palestinians in Gaza, was said to be very low. But since this conflict has gone up, the popularity of Hamas has shot up dramatically. What do you make of these tactics?
Yeah, the whole issue of winning hearts and minds, you might have had a shot at that before October 7th. There is no chance for that now. That's not even on the table. What you have to now do is just even create the possibility of a future and a hope for the Palestinian people. You're not going to win any hearts and minds now, not for the foreseeable future, because of the extraordinary level of anger that has been created by this, massive loss of life and physical destruction. So that's actually off the table. But if Israel doesn't even provide a possibility for future, then the anger is going to even escalate above what is happening because of all the loss of life. So whether Sullivan or President Biden or some of these other officials are telling Israel this behind the scenes, I don't know. I certainly hope so, because we're not doing them any favors by just saying you should be more careful and then not doing anything when they're not. Because Netanyahu has been abundantly clear. He doesn't care what they're saying. He doesn't care what Sullivan says. In fact, he said just, I think yesterday, or maybe it was earlier today, he is going to continue to press forward. He will not do a ceasefire. Basically, he's not going to do anything that the U.S. is asking. And at some point, we're going to come to a point to where we have to say, you're on your own, or we're just going to say, we're going to continue to let you do whatever you want. And then we're not going to have any difference in the public opinion in the world, that we're basically behind them. And that's the stark truth, no matter what anyone wants to say.
All right. Thank you very much indeed, Colonel Davis, for joining us and getting us that perspective there.
Thank you.
The war between Israel and Hamas just continues to intensify. Now, Israel is pressing on with its offensive in the north and also in the southern part of the Gaza Strip. And according to reports that have come in, an estimated 18,700 Palestinians have so far been killed in this campaign of relentless bombing of the Gaza Strip by the Israelis. And an estimated 50,000 Palestinians have been grievously wounded or have been maimed in this conflict so far. Now, Israel, remember, has approved some temporary aid into the Gaza Strip via its Kerem Shalom border. And here's a sum up of all that is happening. The Friday marks day 2 of the U.S. National Security Advisor's visit to Israel. Jake Sullivan met with Netanyahu and also with Yoav Gallant, echoing the United States' concern about the future of Gaza. Now, Jake Sullivan has said that it is pretty inappropriate for Israel to occupy Gaza in the long term. This after Israel reaffirmed on Thursday that Gaza war could, of course, drag on for several months to come. Now, remember, the violence is not confined just to the Gaza Strip. Even in the West Bank, part of the Palestinian-occupied territories, there have been repeated Israeli incursions deep into the Palestinian territories. And what has happened in the last 24 hours is that at least about 11 Palestinians have been killed, including a 13-year-old boy who reportedly died in the aftermath of this raid. The Israeli forces began their raid in Jenin early on Tuesday. The Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas has held talks with the top U.S. officials in West Bank headquarters, emphasizing that Gaza is an integral part of the Palestinian state. He has also added that it is crucial to spare the civilians from the Israeli war machine. Now, Israel continues to pound Gaza with artillery and airstrikes, and smoke could be seen bellowing over the skyline in Gaza as Israeli helicopters and troops continued with their ground assault. The offensive is currently encircling Khan Younis in southern Gaza. On Friday afternoon, a rare air raid warning went off in Jerusalem, with the Iron Dome intercepting some crude missiles that reportedly were fired. Now, Hamas rarely managed to shoot their crude missiles as far as Jerusalem, with most of the missiles targeting towns in southern Israel. And these images were reportedly released by Islamic Jihad in what it claims are Palestinian fighters firing mortar shells towards Israel. Now, Islamic Jihad is the second largest militant group in the Gaza Strip. The situation remains tense in Israel's northern border as well. For the first time since the war began, the Israeli army has dropped leaflets in southern Lebanon. The leaflets carried a warning for the residents to not help Hezbollah. Now, remember, the Hezbollah and Israeli army have been engaged in some skirmishes ever since this conflict began on the 7th of October. And Israel has also dropped similar leaflets during the 2006 war that it fought in Lebanon for a period of 34 days. Now, the Western nations and the European Union released a joint statement on Friday urging Israel to take to stop the unprecedented violence by the Israeli illegal settlers in the West Bank. The signatories included the likes of Australia, Britain, Canada, France, the European Union, along with several other European nations. The statement read that Israel must protect Palestinian civilians in the West Bank. Now, remember, over 280 Palestinian innocent civilians have been killed ever since this bout of violence began on the 7th of October. Moreover, the United Nations has warned that Gaza is teetering on the edge of a possible implosion. Over 1.8 million people have been displaced out of a population of 2.3 million. Hospitals in north have largely stopped functioning altogether, while in the south, they are overwhelmed with patients. And Israel says that it has been encouraging aid into the Gaza Strip, but the United Nations says that aid delivery has been hampered due to continuous air bombings by Israel. And whatever aid is being sent till the Rafah border crossing is not being allowed to enter because of this campaign of bombings, even at the Rafah region. And I earlier spoke with Professor Scott Lucas, who is a professor of international politics at the Clinton Institute in the University College at Dublin. And this is what he had to say in terms of what is unfolding in the Gaza Strip at this moment.
You summarized it in that while the Americans have changed their rhetoric, talk is cheap in the context of actions. Actions which, after Hamas's killing of more than 1,200 people, most of them Israeli civilians and foreign nationals, has wound up killing now almost 19,000 people in Gaza since October 7th, the large majority of them civilians. If the United States was serious about curbing the Israeli air and ground attacks, they could have done one of two things, which you mentioned. They could have, earlier this week, cast their veto in the UN Security Council, or sorry, they could have refrained from casting their veto in the UN Security Council earlier this week on a resolution calling for a ceasefire, therefore giving the diplomatic signal that this offensive should be halted. Or secondly, they could cut or restrict their military assistance to Israel.
First up on the show, well, has the Biden administration had a serious rethink over its support for Israel? If the latest comments are anything to go by, America wants the war to wrap up soon. It wants high-intensity fighting to end for more precision-targeted warfare, and it's asking for civilian casualties to go down. America's national security advisor is in Israel to exert pressure. Now, is the Biden administration clamping under domestic compulsions? In meetings with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the rest of Israel's war cabinet, Jake Sullivan has urged Tel Aviv to shift military operations to more targeted actions. Sullivan, in fact, spoke to Israeli leaders about a timetable for winding down the intense combat phase of the war. American officials say they are not making judgments about whether Israel is abiding by the laws of war, but evidently the U.S. has gathered intelligence that might allow it to make such assessments. In fact, a new U.S. intelligence assessment has revealed that nearly half of the Israeli airstrikes on Gaza have been imprecise. They have been called dumb bombs that can pose a greater threat to civilians. In a first, Biden has also criticized Israel for its indiscriminate bombing in Gaza. He even declared that Netanyahu has to change, something he tried to walk back from the next day.
I want them to be focused on how to save civilian lives, not stop going after Hamas, but be more careful.
This, as mixed signals have continued from America. Just on Tuesday, the White House spokesperson said that Israel had done a lot more to protect civilians than even America could. Now America is pushing its top advisor Sullivan to discuss a two-state solution with Israel that involves the Palestinian Authority as well.
I have and will continue to state President Biden and the United States' commitment to preserving space for peace, for a two-state solution where Israel's security is guaranteed.
Sullivan is also set to meet the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas to discuss post-war arrangements for Gaza, and according to a senior U.S. official, this could include reactivating Palestinian security forces. Driven out by Hamas in its 2007 takeover of the territory, the proposal is the first specific indicator of Washington's vision for security arrangements in Gaza. If Israel achieves its U.S.-backed objective to end Hamas control, any role for Palestinian security forces in Gaza is bound to elicit strong opposition from Israel, which seeks to maintain an open-ended security presence there. Israel says it won't allow a post-war foothold for the Palestinian Authority. And with Netanyahu saying he's more determined than ever to continue the war, the Biden administration finds itself between a rock and a hard place, especially in view of opposing voices like the Vice President Kamala Harris, urging him to show more sensitivity to the plight of Palestinian civilians.
So this, of course, is the big story of the moment, concern over the mounting casualties in the Israel-Hamas war. The American administration, which has a lot of leverage on Tel Aviv, is now trying to persuade Israel to try and change the strategy that Israel has deployed. Washington has sent its White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan to Israel. Sullivan has met with the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu in Tel Aviv in an attempt to try and convince the Israelis the importance of protecting civilian lives. Now, according to a White House statement, Jake Sullivan and Netanyahu discussed the possibility of shifting from high-intensity clearing operations to undertaking some low-intensity surgical operations.
He did talk about possible transitioning from what we would call high-intensity operations, which is what we're seeing them do now, to lower-intensity operations sometime, in the near future. But I don't want to put a timestamp
And also, John Kirby said that Washington wants to see the war end as soon as possible. But the American spokesperson again added a bit of a rider, saying that it is Hamas that has the ultimate responsibility for ending this conflict.
If Hamas would release all the hostages, lay down their arms, and surrender up those responsible for the October 7th attacks.
Now, Israel, remember, has vowed to keep fighting. It has imposed a complete siege of the Gaza Strip and has continued with its devastating campaign of air bombings and also its ground offensive. Now, the Israeli Prime Minister has claimed that even though there is a lot of pain and there is a lot of international pressure because of the mounting civilian casualties and the humanitarian catastrophe in the Gaza Strip, there is nothing that Netanyahu says that will now stop the Israeli forces under him.
I see there is the start of an understanding that we are determined to continue until the end and to destroy this entity.
Now, despite the repeated American expressions of concern, Israel has not shown any signs of heeding the United States' calls for showing and exercising a certain level of restraint to protect civilian lives. A new U.S. intelligence assessment has said that nearly about 40 to 45% of the 29,000 air-to-ground ammunitions that Israel used in bombing the Gaza Strip were all dumb bombs. That means that these bombs were fired randomly at unspecified targets. Now, these unguided missiles are in fact taking a huge toll on civilian lives, especially in these very densely populated areas. And the rate at which Israel is using the dumb bombs, it's unlikely that it can stem the soaring civilian death toll. No wonder then that the United States President Joe Biden is also facing a lot of backlash at home for his unequivocal support to the Israeli war. But remember, bear in mind, the Americans are the ones who are also supplying the Israelis with a lot of these dumb bombs. In the beginning of this month, Vice President Kamala Harris had urged her colleagues at the White House to show more concern publicly for the humanitarian damage in the Gaza Strip.
As Israel defends itself, it matters how. The United States is unequivocal. International humanitarian law must be respected. Too many innocent Palestinians have been killed. Frankly, the scale of civilian suffering and the images and videos coming from Gaza are devastating.
Now, the United States has provided billions of dollars of weapons and ammunition and bombs that Israel has been dropping on the Gaza Strip. Nearly about 15,000 bombs and some 57,000 artillery shells have in fact been sent by Washington to Tel Aviv. A lot of the weapons that were meant to go to Ukraine are also being redirected to the Israelis. The United States has also provided diplomatic cover in the face of overwhelming international condemnation for Israel's conduct in this war, notably by vetoing a United Nations Security Council resolution that would have demanded for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. So far, Netanyahu has rejected the US plan and is now betting his political survival on opposing the authorities' role in post-war Gaza. But this is, of course, going to be pretty difficult for the United States, and it now remains to be seen as to how this will play out diplomatically. And also to give us more perspective on this, we're being joined by Professor Scott Lucas, who is a professor of international politics at the Clinton Institute in the University College Dublin. Is joining us live from Birmingham in the United Kingdom. Professor, let me in fact begin by asking you this. What we've witnessed over the course of the last few days is that the United States appears to have changed its stance to a certain extent in the way it has been backing Israel. It is urging Tel Aviv to exercise more restraint to ensure that the civilian casualties that are being witnessed in the Gaza Strip are not as bad as what is being witnessed. Do you think the Americans can actually prevail over Tel Aviv?
I think you summarized it in that while the Americans have changed their rhetoric, talk is cheap in the context of actions. Actions which, after Hamas's killing of more than 1,200 people, most of them Israeli civilians and foreign nationals, has wound up killing now almost 19,000 people in Gaza since October 7th, the large majority of them civilians. if the United States was serious about curbing the Israeli air and ground attacks, they could have done one of two things, which you mentioned. They could have, earlier this week, cast their veto in the UN Security Council, or sorry, they could have refrained from casting their veto in the UN Security Council earlier this week on a resolution calling for a ceasefire, therefore giving the diplomatic signal that this offensive should be halted. Or secondly, they could cut or restrict their military assistance to Israel. But far from doing that, American officials, I suspect American officials who are not happy with what is going on, leaked to the media last week that the United States since October the 7th has provided more than 15,000 bombs and more than 50,000 shells to Israel. More than 10,000 of those 15,000 bombs, as you mentioned, are unguided bombs. They're not precise. They don't target fighters. They kill civilians as well. Despite that coming out, Joe Biden last Friday, even as he said civilian casualties should be limited, asked Congress to authorize another 45,000 tank shells to Israel. Tank shells which would not be used to defend Israel, but in an offensive. So no, I'm sorry. Joe Biden, Jake Sullivan, Kamala Harris, you don't have leverage over Israel because you gave up your leverage over Israel. And no statements you make, no statements that Jake Sullivan matter publicly today if there is not a private challenge to the Israeli War Cabinet to stop this killing of civilians as well as of Hamas fighters. And if you don't stop this killing of civilians, we will call for a ceasefire and we will restrict the military shipments.
And also, Professor Lucas, how isolated do you think the United States has become on the international scene because of its backing of Israel? We've been witnessing as to how, this issue has been voted upon both in the UNSC and also in the UNGA, where unequivocally there are nations that have been demanding that there should be a humanitarian ceasefire, but the United States is the one that has used its veto at the UNSC to block a resolution demanding for the ceasefire.
Well, I think, again, clearly you summarized it, and that is there have been a number of countries who have not yet called for a ceasefire. Indeed, the European Union at its summit today in Brussels is unlikely to call for a ceasefire while they are moving towards calling for more humanitarian aid. But in that Security Council of 15 members earlier this week, 13 voted for a ceasefire, including France, including Asian members. The United Kingdom abstained on the resolution. Only the U.S. votes no.
Absolutely.
In the General Assembly, a couple of days later, when an overwhelming 153 of 193 nations call for a ceasefire, countries like France, Japan, Australia vote for the ceasefire. The U.S. again votes no. So no, I mean, there is no moral as well as political high ground that the U.S. can claim right now when it is seen as enabling, not just standing aside from, but enabling the ongoing killing in Gaza.
Absolutely, indeed, Professor Lucas. Thank you very much indeed for joining us with that perspective there.
Thank you.
Meanwhile, a new U.S. intelligence assessment has found that almost half of the air-to-ground munitions Israel has used in Gaza since the war began have been unguided bombs. The revelation comes as the United States and Israeli officials engage in intensifying conversations about the sequencing of military operations in the conflict. Now, Gaza officials say Israel's military offensive has killed nearly 19,000 people, most of whom were women and children. Now, these unguided bombs are otherwise known as dumb bombs. The use of so many unguided bombs, first reported by CNN, is a concern among humanitarian groups and others. Washington has been calling for weeks for Israel to take more care to avoid civilian casualties in Gaza, saying that too many Palestinians have been killed. Now, what exactly are these dumb or unguided bombs? They are conventional or nuclear aircraft delivered bombs that do not contain a guidance system. Now, in the absence of a guidance system, such bombs simply follow a ballistic trajectory. Now, this makes them far harder to aim and therefore far more likely to strike unintended targets. Therefore, they put civilians at risk. Dumb bombs were used commonly during the Second World War, and they continued to make up the vast majority of aircraft-delivered bombs until the late 1980s. They have now largely been replaced by precision-guided munitions, which are guided towards a specific target. Dumb bombs are typically aerodynamic in shape, usually with tail fins, to reduce drag and increase stability after release. In order to detonate upon impact, they tend to use a contact fuse. An increasing number of voices in the United States, notably from the left wing of the Democratic Party, have called on Biden to take a firmer stand towards his Israeli ally and even to condition military aid. As for Politico, US Vice President has been telling colleagues in the administration that she wants the White House to show more concern for the humanitarian damage in Gaza. In internal talks about the war in Gaza, Kamala Harris has argued that it is time to start making day-after plans for how to handle the wreckage of the war once the fighting ends. Harris's push to shape the White House message reflects the extent to which Democrats, even the top two officials in the nation, are struggling to walk a careful line. Infighting is spreading, slowly but meaningfully, at every layer of the Democratic Party over Biden's full-throated support of Israel. Pro-Palestinian Democrats are outraged at the rising death tolls in Gaza made possible by Biden's posture. Day after day, more House Democrats are criticizing Israel's expanding ground operations, raising concerns with Biden's policy and even calling for a ceasefire. Our top story at this hour, a new US intelligence assessment has found that almost half of the air-to-ground munitions Israel has used in Gaza since the war began have been unguided bombs. Now, the revelation comes as the United States and Israeli officials engage in intensifying conversations about the sequencing of military operations in the conflict. Gaza officials say Israel's military offensive has killed nearly 19,000 people, most of whom were women and children. Now, these unguided bombs are otherwise known as dumb bombs. The use of so many unguided bombs, first reported by CNN, is a concern among humanitarian groups and others. Washington has been calling for weeks for Israel to take more care to avoid civilian casualties in Gaza, saying that too many Palestinians have been killed. Now, what exactly are these dumb or unguided bombs? They are conventional or nuclear aircraft-delivered bombs that do not contain a guidance system. In the absence of a guidance system, such bombs simply follow a ballistic trajectory. This makes them far harder to aim and therefore far more likely to strike unintended targets. Therefore, they put civilians at risk. Dumb bombs were used commonly during the Second World War, and they continued to make up the vast majority of aircraft-delivered bombs until the late 1980s. They have now largely been replaced by precision-guided munitions, which are guided towards a specific target. Dumb bombs are typically aerodynamic in shape, usually with tail fins to reduce drag and increase stability after release. In order to detonate upon impact, they tend to use a contact fuse. An increasing number of voices in the United States, notably from the left wing of the Democratic Party, have called on Biden to take a firmer stand toward his Israeli ally and even to condition military aid. As for Politico, US Vice President has been telling colleagues in the administration that she wants White House to show more concern for the humanitarian damage in Gaza. The internal talks about the war in Gaza, Kamala Harris has argued that it is time to start making day-after plans to how to handle wreckage of the war once the fighting ends. Harris's push to shape the White House message reflects the extent to which Democrats, even the top two officials in the nations, are struggling to walk a careful line. Infighting is spreading, but slowly, but meaningfully at every layer of the Democratic Party over Biden's full-throated support of Israel. Pro-Palestinian Democrats are outraged at the rising death tolls in Gaza, made possible by Biden's posture. Day after day, more House Democrats are criticizing Israel's expanding ground operations, raising concern with Biden's policy and even calling for a ceasefire.
Hospital, refugee camp, school, there is nowhere safe in Gaza. The situation right now is dire. It is getting worse with every single day as this war stretches. There is no food, no clean water, no medicines. As per the UN, half the population in Gaza, which is around 1 million people, are at risk of starvation. Our next report explains.
Even in death, these Palestinians are not allowed to rest in peace. Israel's recent attacks on the Jabalia refugee camp have damaged the graves of hundreds of Gazans. What you see are marks reportedly left by IDF vehicles. It has been almost 70 days, and the war on Gaza knows no end. The death toll is near 19,000. Half a million people have been injured. Around 1.8 million, that is 80% of the Gaza population, is displaced.
The boy was born early in the war, a little over a month ago. My love, my love.
Infants, elderly, men and women, all are the casualties in this war. Israel is headstrong on its motive. They want to wipe out Hamas. But it's the civilians who are paying the price. Most of those killed in this Israeli operation are Gazan civilians. The concerns over the collective punishment keeps getting louder. For those living in the besieged strip, the reality is no less than doomsday. People don't know if they will survive another day. And if they do, how will they keep themselves alive with no supplies, no clear water, no real roof on their head?
There is no food or drink. The house is destroyed. There is nothing. There is no money. Please stop the war in us. For God's sake. We are innocent people. We have nothing. We own nothing.
This week, a senior UN official raised alarm over the collapsing humanitarian situation in Gaza.
About half of the population in Gaza are starving, and the needs that we are meeting is really nothing. The humanitarian operation is collapsing. With the chaos, with this active fighting, it's not possible to do the work that is needed to meet these massive needs. And so we need supplies at a completely different scale.
Israel is attacking Gaza in the north, south, and center. One such city is Rafah, that was attacked